Hello, this is my 2003 Land Rover Defender. Recently I took it for its annual MOT and unfortunately it failed. It failed on two items. It requires a little bit of welding at the rear, and also, as you can see here, there's too much play in the steering. The MOT inspector identified the play being caused by a faulty drop arm. The drop arm is also known as the Pitman arm. It is attached to the output shaft of the steering box and attaches to the drag link, which then steers the vehicle. Here you can see, for identification purposes, the inspector has marked the drop arm with his yellow chalk. So firstly, so that I can access the drop arm comfortably, I've got to remove this aftermarket steering guard. Once I've put the steering guard to one side, I remove the split pin that's locking the nut on top of the ball joint. I then loosen and remove the carcellated nut from the top of the ball joint. I then turn my attention to the nut on the bottom of the shaft from the steering box. Before I can remove this large nut, I've got to knock back the tab on the locking washer. To do this I use a punch, but I could have used a chisel, which probably would have been a cold chisel, that is, which probably would have been easier, but the punch was just the right length and I persevered with it. Once I've knocked the tab back, I can get a socket squarely on the big nut. The socket size that I require is 34mm, and here I've got it connected to an extension bar, and I'm using a 3-foot breaker bar, which you can't actually see. I haven't shown that, unfortunately. When the nut and washer are removed, I can start pulling the drop link from the splines of the steering box. To do this successfully, I'm going to use a puller. Basically, the puller engages on two lugs either side of the drop link. Once engaged and centered, it's just a case of tightening up the bolt, which engages with the shaft of the steering box. Normally, to protect the threads on the end of the shaft of the steering box, I would replace the nut loosely. But in this instance, there's not enough room, so I've got to be very careful when tightening up the bolt. Fortunately, as I've had this drop arm off before, or replaced it before, it wasn't too much trouble to remove it. The next task is to separate the ball joint from the drag link. I've got a different tool for this. It's supposed to be a ball joint separator. As you can see, it's not a very successful tool, so I have to resort to giving the ball joint a quick whack with a hammer. At this point, I wondered if you'd consider subscribing. It is free and it helps give incentive to create more content. Thank you. And if you have already subscribed, I thank you very much for your subscription. So once the old one's out of the way, it's just a case of unwrapping the new one and going through the refitting process. The new drop link comes with a new carcellated nut and a split pin. So before fitting the U-drop arm onto the steering box shaft, I give the steering box shaft splines a coat of copper grease. Hopefully this will help when I have to remove the drop arm again, because it seems nearly every other year I have to replace these drop arms. So it's relatively easy to fit the drop arm. It can only go on one way, as there are some flat spots on the splines which can only line up with the flat spots on the drop arm. I put copper grease on all the threads and all the pieces that are going to go together. When I assemble it, I suddenly realise that I haven't actually connected the drop arm to the drag link, so I have to pull the drop arm off. Fortunately, I haven't done the nut up. Here you can see me, I'm refitting the locking washer and putting the nut on. I'm just going to basically tighten this nut until I can't tighten it anymore, and then give it an extra tighten. When I'm happy that it's pulled up and it's really tight, I then just bend over the locking tab on the washer. It's bent both up and down, and this should stop or prevent the nut from ever just spinning off under its own steam. Here you can see the drop arm rising up the splines of the shaft, and the nut really pushes it up there and tightens it in. Once the washer's locked over, it's then time to turn my attention to the ball joint. Not happy with where the split pin was sitting on the castellated nut. I realised that I'd forgotten to put a washer on there, so I put the washer on, and then that made sure that the split pin was well within the castellated nut. With the washer fitted, it was just a case of torquing down the nut. When the nut was torqued down, I was fortunate that the holes lined up so that I could just get the split pin in with no problem. I don't know why I'm doing this here, but I'm just putting a bit of copper grease over the nut for some reason. This slot on the back of the drop arm is used for centering the steering. When the slot is lined up with a hole that's in the steering box, and here you can see I've put a punch through the slot and the holes to make sure that they're aligned, the steering is centred. For some reason my steering wheel had become off centre, so I'm taking this opportunity to centre it up. But before I remove the steering wheel, you can see here how little play there is in the steering now. It's quite simple to remove the steering wheel. Just remove the logo from the centre, then undo the nut. And what I do, I undo the nut, say 90% of the way, then I give the steering wheel a big whack from underneath. This prevents it from flying off and hitting me in the face. When I've got the steering wheel off, it's just then a case of repositioning this blue thing that's over the steering column so that the slots are in the right position. And the little blue tag that I'm pointing at here is on the left. If this little blue tag isn't on the left, then my indicators won't automatically reset. So that's it. Steering wheel back on, just do the nut up tight, put the logo back in, and I'm just ready for a bit of welding now.